Good evening all and welcome. Tonight I have a chilling collection of scary stories that happened while being alone at night. And I'd like to wish a very happy birthday to Lydia. I hope you've had a fantastic day. To get a birthday shout out, check out the link in the description for Patreon. But for now it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I'm about to share with you what I consider to be the most traumatic event of my life. My mum, for context, was an alcoholic. Let me take you back to when I was 14. I woke up to the sound of the wind scraping against the old window pane. The branches of the dead tree in the yard were clawing at the glass. I blinked in the darkness. Something felt off. I looked at the clock, and it read 2:43 a.m. I remember that like it was yesterday. I just knew my mum hadn't got home. For a start, I'm a light sleeper, and whenever she trundles into the house, she usually makes lots of noise, regardless of the time she gets there. She was supposed to be back hours ago, but she wasn't. Again. I shouldn't have been surprised. She said she'd be home by 10, maybe 11. But I knew where she was, probably face down at a dive bar or wherever she'd stumbled to tonight, and lately it had been getting worse. She'd go out promising just to have a few, and I'd wake up alone. Sometimes she came back before dawn, sometimes she didn't, especially if she met male company. And tonight was one of the nights she didn't. I sighed, trying to push the bitterness down, but it was hard. Like I said, I was only 14, but I felt so much older. I was the one who made sure the lights were off before bed, the one who cleaned up the bottles she left behind, the one who had to lie to her boss when she was too hungover to go to work, and basically had to try to manage my own life and hers, and I really resented her for it. But I wanted her to get better. I rolled onto my side, pulling the thin blanket tighter around me. The night was really cold. And then I heard a noise. It was faint, like a soft scraping sound, like someone was fiddling with the door. But it wasn't the front door. It sounded like the basement door. Then it became a rhythmic thud, like someone was trying to get in. My stomach dropped. I contemplated it. An intruder? No, of course not. It had to be my mum. Who else would be wanting to try and break into our hovel of a house? Surely she was too drunk to remember her keys, or maybe she'd just forgotten how to open the door. At any rate, I couldn't let my mum be outside in the cold. So, with fear twisting inside me like a knot, I was telling myself I was being paranoid, and I had to check. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. I tiptoed my way towards the hall, breath hitching in every step. The door to the basement was cracked open, and the noise was louder now, a continual thud. I crept towards the stairs, making the very old wood groan beneath my weight. I paused at the top, peering down into the darkness. "Mum?" But there was no response. The thud continued. I could see the door, but couldn't see who was behind it. We had frosted glass on that door, and the further I went down the stairs, the more I noticed that there was something wrong in the shape. The silhouette didn't look like my mum. It looked more like a man. That's when panic really set in. There were 2 locks on the basement door. Your standard one that you could probably pry open with a knife if you really tried, and the one at the top, a sort of deadbolt. But we never used that one. Mum would forget her keys often, and it wouldn't be unusual for her to sneak into the basement. That's when I heard a click, and the door swung open. It was a pivotal moment. I was standing in the darkness, right there near the base of the stairs. That's when I heard the man chuckle to himself. Jackpot. Panic flooded my veins, and I felt an overwhelming heat bloom in my stomach. My legs trembling, my bladder betrayed me, and warmth started spreading down my thighs as I wet myself, the fear taking over me completely. I was fortunate, because as I had wet myself, the man wasn't looking directly at me. He was looking up, shouting to his cronies, who shouted back at him to open the main door. Maybe they were too lazy to take the basement route. In those few precious moments, pee clinging to my leg, I slowly and silently shuffled behind a box and prayed to whichever deity was listening that he didn't investigate. The man walked into the door, and he went up the basement stairs. I then heard an audible click as he unlocked the front door and he let his two cronies in. Words can't describe just how scared I was, knowing that I was not only vulnerable because I was young and a girl and alone in my house in the middle of the night, but that these men might have firearms or other weapons and they may try to hurt me or worse. My only option was the house phone, which was right outside the basement door, which meant climbing up the steps. What if they heard me? What if they saw me? I tried telling myself that logically they wouldn't try and come down to the basement. Maybe they'd just try and look for the valuables and leave. I was too afraid, but I knew I had to do something. So I started climbing the stairs, inching my way up, praying they wouldn't hear me. Every creak of the wood beneath my feet felt deafening. My wet pajama pants stuck to my skin, making me shiver as I moved. And when I reached the top, I saw it. Through the crack in the door which they hadn't closed, the phone was hanging on the wall. I stuck my hand out gingerly and reached for the receiver and pulled it off the cradle. I was shaking so badly I nearly dropped it, and I ducked behind the door, pulling the phone cord with me as I pressed the numbers. 911. The line clicked. 911, what's your emergency? I opened my mouth to speak, but then I heard one of the men shout, "Hey!" One of them saw the phone cord going into the basement. Oh God, he's coming. My blood turned to ice. I dropped the phone and bolted down the basement stairs. I didn't think, I just ran. Behind me I heard them thundering after me. "Someone's down there." I hit the cold basement floor and darted behind a pile of old boxes and threw a dusty blanket covering myself, curling myself into the tightest ball I could manage. My body shook so hard I was afraid they'd hear me breathing, and I held my breath. "Who was that down there? Don't move, little girl, we're not gonna hurt you." That's when I heard the sound of one of them slip and a big thud. I waited for a few seconds, but the basement was quiet. I peeked out, and I could see the man on the ground. My pee. He slipped in the puddle I left on the floor, and he had hit his head on the corner of the banister, and he wasn't moving. In that moment I didn't think. I made my way out the basement door, taking them two at a time. My legs burnt and I pushed through it, and I just kept on running. I didn't look back. I stopped when I got to a neighbor's house because I heard the sound of sirens approaching. I realized they were making a way towards my house, and I just fell to the ground and started crying. It wasn't before long that police found me, and after calming me down, I explained everything that happened. The man in the basement was still unconscious, and his friends, they ran when they heard the sirens, but they didn't get too far. All three were caught within hours. And my mum? She didn't even come home that night. When they called her, she was still at the bar, too wasted to understand or care. And CPS took me away that night, and I moved in with my dad shortly after, 2 states away. I haven't seen her since, and I don't want to. The men who broke in are rotting in prison now, but no sentence could fix what happened to me that night. And I'm still scared of going down into the basement. The nightmares of what happened that night never quite leave me. I just wish my mum had been there. Everything would have been different. This happened about 6 years ago when I was 27. I was working at a bar back then. The kind of place that stayed open until way too late and drew in all kinds of people. By the time I clocked out, it was usually close to 3 a.m. The streets were quiet at that hour, and I lived close enough that I could walk home. Most nights I didn't mind. It was only a 10-minute walk, and the silence after the night of noise was almost comforting. But that night something felt off. There were 2 routes I could take home. The first was along the main strip where the bars and clubs were, still buzzing with life even at 3 a.m. That street was always alive with drunk strangers stumbling out of clubs and shouting into the night. I'd walked that way before, but I was so drained that the thought of weaving through crowds and deflecting unwanted attention made my skin crawl. So I took the other route, the quieter one, the darker one. The streetlights were sparse along the road, and the buildings on either side were mostly closed up, silent and lifeless. I told myself I'd be fine. I'd walked this way plenty of times before, but the heavy quiet pressed down on me as I moved, and I felt it, that feeling like I was being watched. I was halfway home when I saw them. A group of 3 or 4 guys stumbling towards me loud and drunk, their voices echoing down the empty street, slurred and obnoxious. I tried to step to the side to avoid them, but one of them deliberately moved to block my path. "Hey sweetheart, where you heading?" I ignored them and kept walking, but they circled around me like vultures, laughing as they slowed down. "Come on, don't be rude, we're just being friendly." My pulse was pounding. "Calm down. Don't panic." "I'm not interested," I said, my voice firm. They lingered a bit too long and exchanged glances, but finally, after what felt like forever, they let me past. "Cow," one of them muttered as I walked away, but I didn't look back. I kept walking, heart pounding in my ears. I was almost home when I heard it. The slow roll of tires. I glanced over my shoulder, and a taxi had pulled up beside me, moving at my pace. The driver rolled down the window. "You all right, love?" His voice was calm and concerned. He appeared to be an older guy, maybe in his late 50s, with a kind face. "I saw what happened back there. Do you want a ride?" I stopped walking and hesitated. It was just a few blocks, and I felt safe. He saw the doubt on my face and added, "I won't even charge you, just want to make sure you get home safe." Something in my gut told me to keep walking, but I didn't listen. I got in. The cab smelled of stale cigarettes and air freshener. "Where to?" he asked casually, like this was just another ride. I gave him my address, which was just a few minutes away, and we began driving. I offered to pay him, but he shook his head. "Don't worry about it." Everything seemed fine at first. We were heading in the right direction, and I began to relax. I even felt a bit silly for being so paranoid. But then he missed my turn. "Oh, that was my street." "Oh no," he said, quickly glancing at me in the rearview mirror. "Just finding a place to turn around." My stomach dropped. A place to turn around? We weren't anywhere near a place to turn around. I watched the buildings blur as we moved by, further from my neighborhood. We entered an industrial area. Empty lots, abandoned buildings, and warehouses that hadn't seen life in years. "What are you doing?" I asked. He didn't answer, though. "This is the perfect place to turn around." "Turn around!" My voice was now sharper, but his hand stayed steady on the wheel. He wasn't lost. He wasn't even looking for a place to turn. And the car slowed down, and we hit a dead end. There were no lights, no witnesses, just me and him, and I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing. Do I run? Do I fight? What if the doors are locked? The silence in the cab was getting to me, and I forced myself to speak. "This is perfect. You can turn around here." For a moment he didn't respond, and then he looked at me, and something in his eyes changed. I don't know what he saw in my face. Maybe the sheer terror, maybe the realization that I was about to scream and fight with everything I had. But whatever it was, it stopped him. "You're right," he muttered. And just like that, he turned the car around. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. I kept my eyes locked on the road, counting down the seconds until I was back in a familiar environment. When we got close to my place, I told him to stop a block away. "Here's fine," I said, voice shaking slightly. I didn't want him to know exactly where I lived. I got out so fast I nearly tripped. As I walked away, my legs felt like lead. When I got inside my apartment, I locked every single door and window, and I sat on the floor, my back pressed against the door, trying to calm my breathing. I could have died that night. I didn't tell anyone for a while. I was too ashamed. Why did I get in that car? Years later, when I walk alone at night, I hear the distant hum of tires slowly rolling behind me. It's usually just another car, but sometimes it reminds me of how lucky I am to still be around, and how close I was to probably vanishing off the face of the earth if that taxi driver hadn't have changed his mind at the last minute. This happened to me when I was 15 back in 2005. I'm older now, and the memory still sends a chill down my spine. I had a part-time job at a seaside pleasure fair and bowling alley. I'd been working there since I was 14 after school and on weekends to help my mum out. She was a single parent with 2 kids and money was tight. I didn't mind working. I liked having extra cash to spend every few weeks. At the time, I was dating a guy from school, and his family was rich. They lived in this fancy part of town, just outside the city where the houses had long driveways and actual gates. Well, one night after work, I agreed to go to his house. His mum said she'd drive me home at around 10:30. The only catch was that I had to take 2 buses to get there. The first bus took me to the outskirts of the city, and the second bus would drop me at about a 15-minute walk from his house. I didn't think much of it, I'd done it before, so after work I hopped on the second bus. It was pretty full when I got on, which made me feel safe. But as the route took us further and further out of the city, people started getting off at each stop. My comfort level dropped with every passenger that left, and I kept hoping at least 1 or 2 people would stay on the ride back to the city. By the time we hit the final stop, the terminus, it was just me, the driver, and 1 other man. I glanced at the remaining passenger. I thought he was just another rider, but I was wrong. He wasn't just a random guy, he was the driver's friend. We pulled into the terminus and everything went dead silent. No streetlights, no other buses, just darkness pressing in on all sides. The air was thick and cold. It must have been winter because in Scotland night falls early. I checked my phone, 7:30 p.m. It was the era of flip phones, and I had my trusty pink Motorola Razr, but there was no Facebook, no Instagram to distract me in the unsettling silence. Then the bus engine cut off. The light inside the bus flickered and went out, plunging me into almost complete darkness. The driver stepped out of his cab and casually announced, "Gotta take a break. Be back in 15. I managed a shaky, "Okay." The driver and his friends stepped off the bus, leaving me alone. I could hear them just outside, talking and laughing, but their voices were muffled. Still, I caught bits and pieces of their conversation, and that's when I heard something that made my stomach drop. They weren't just talking, they were bragging. I heard them laughing about their latest conquests, girls who were too drunk to remember anything. I heard them mention a girl who had passed out at a party, and one of them had dared the other to do unspeakable things to them. And they were laughing about it, like it was all a joke. My blood turned to ice. I was alone, in the middle of nowhere, with 2 men who clearly had no problem crossing horrifying lines. My mind raced. What do I do? I didn't want to make a move that would set them off. I was frozen, but my instinct screamed at me to be ready. I clutched my phone, my mum's number ready to dial the second they stepped back on the bus. A few minutes passed, but it felt like hours, and then I heard the footsteps as they came back on. When they stepped onto the bus, I could feel their eyes on me. so I kept my head down, hoping they'd just leave me alone. They walked over towards me, their footsteps slow and deliberate. "Hey, girlie," the driver said, his voice dripping with sleaze. "What's your name?" My throat went dry. "Sarah," I lied, barely getting the words out, and they smiled at each other. "How old are you, Sarah?" they asked, moving closer. 15? They exchanged a look that I never want to see again. "Where you heading, sweetheart?" the driver chimed in, leaning against one of the seats. My mind was screaming at me to calm down, to not let them know how terrified I was. I kept my answer short, trying not to give them anything they could use, but their questions got worse. "You got a boyfriend? What do you like to do for fun? Are you a virgin?" My skin crawled. I could feel the bile rising in my throat. They were getting bolder, their questions more invasive. I was trapped, and I knew it. Then, blessedly, the radio in the driver's cab crackled to life. A voice came through calling for the driver to give an update. His demeanor changed instantly. His head snapped towards the radio, and he muttered something under his breath. He glanced at his friend, and with a forced grin said, "Looks like we gotta cut this short, pal." He climbed back into the driver's seat, fired up the engine, and the bus roared to life. Lights flicked on, and I could finally breathe again. His friend shot me one last unsettling smile before sauntering to the front of the bus, and I sat there shaking, too afraid to move. We drove for about 10 minutes back towards the city, and I watched the landmarks pass by, counting down the stops until I could get the hell off that bus. When we were close to my stop, I stood up and pressed the bell, but my heart was pounding because I knew I'd have to walk past both of them to get to the door. As the bus slowed, I waited until the last possible second. Then I bolted. I practically ran past them, ignoring the sickening grins on their faces. "Bye, girlie," one of them called out, followed by catcalls and jeers that echoed through the night as the bus pulled away. I didn't stop running until I reached my boyfriend's house. I collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. His mum heard the commotion and came rushing out. When I told her what happened, she hugged me tight, holding me like she could somehow take the terror away. "Do you want to go home?" she asked gently. Through my tears, I nodded. She and my boyfriend drove me home, where my worried mum was waiting. His mum had called her before we left. My mum wanted to report them, but I begged her not to. I was terrified that they'd find me if I stirred the pot. I was a scared and embarrassed 15-year-old who just wanted to forget, but I never could. To this day, I wonder how close I came to something much worse that night, and I still sometimes hear their voices echoing in my mind when the nights get too quiet. Remember to trust your instincts, because sometimes it's the only thing that can keep you alive. I was just trying to get home. It was late, about 2 a.m. I'd just finished my shift at the pub, dead tired after being on my feet for about 10 hours. My eyelids felt heavy, my body aching as I navigated the winding back roads. I could have taken the highway, but this route was quicker, and I was desperate to crawl into bed. I didn't think, I just wanted to be home. The road was a dark, endless ribbon, cutting through dense forest on both sides. My headlights barely pierced the thick gloom. There were no streetlights on these back roads, no other cars, just me and the night. And within a few minutes, I'd be in my bed. That's when I saw it. A car seat. It was sitting in the middle of the road, the kind of ones where you put babies in. My heart skipped a beat and I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car lurched to a stop just a few feet away from it, and I stared at it, my mind racing. It looked so out of place. A small grey infant car seat just sitting there. But was there someone in it? A baby, perhaps? My blood ran cold. I'd read about this kind of thing, how traffickers or carjackers can use decoys to get women to stop. But that was in big cities, not here, not in the middle of nowhere. I sat there, staring out at it, wondering what my next move should be. My brain screaming at me to drive or go around it. But what if there was someone in there? What if a baby had fallen out? The thought made my stomach lurch. I cracked the window, listening. Silence. Just the whisper of the wind rustling through the trees. No cries, no sounds at all. Go, I told myself again, but my hand was already reaching for the door handle. I thought to myself, I'll just check quickly. I stepped out into the cold night air. As I crept towards the seat, my pulse pounded in my ears, the back of my neck prickling with dread. I knelt beside it, my hands trembling as I reached it. There was a blanket there, and as I went back to pull the hooded part where the head would be, it was empty. And that's when I heard it. A branch snapped. My head whipped around. The forest was too dark, too thick, and I couldn't see anything beyond the reach of my headlights. I started to run, but it was already too late. A hand grabbed me from behind, clamping over my mouth. I screamed, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the night. I kicked and thrashed, but they were strong, laughing and jeering. "Oi, oi, what we got here then, mate?" And I felt a sharp sting of something striking the back of my head, and pain exploded in my skull, and the world blurred. I hit the ground hard. I struggled to crawl away, but then I felt a kick to my midsection, and then another hit on the head, and everything went black. I woke up with dirt in my mouth. My head was pounding, the pain so intense I thought I was going to be sick. My body felt heavy, like I was being weighed down by lead. My face was pressed against something rough. Branches, twigs, leaves. I was in a bush. And to add insult to injury, my hands were prickling. When I moved them, I had brushed a stinging nettle. Go figure. For a moment, I couldn't remember what happened. I just knew something was wrong, and then it came flooding back. The car seat, the hands, the pain. My eyes flew open and I tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness crashed over me. I blinked, trying to focus. It was still dark, but the sky was beginning to lighten. I struggled to my feet, my legs shaking beneath me. I was so cold. My uniform was torn and I was covered in dirt and scratches. My head throbbed with every step as I stumbled out of the bush. I was somewhere, but where? My car was gone. Panic seized me. I was alone in the middle of nowhere. I looked around, but all I saw were endless trees and an empty stretch of road. No cars, no houses, nothing. My phone. I patted my pocket, but they were empty. Tears burned my eyes. I was shaking, my body screaming at me to lie down and to give up. But I couldn't. I gathered my bearings and knew I was on the route home, and I started walking. My feet dragged along the road, each step agony. I didn't know where I was going exactly. I just knew I had to keep moving. My vision blurred, my balance swaying as I staggered forward, my throat dry. Time stopped making sense. Minutes, hours, I don't know how long I walked before I saw a faint glow in the distance. It was the village. I pushed myself towards it, my body screaming in protest. My legs felt like they were going to give out, but I couldn't stop. I stumbled onto the narrow street, barely keeping myself upright. The village was quiet, but there was the small, flickering sign that I had pictured in my mind. A&E. I made it to the door, which opened automatically as I let myself in the emergency center, my strength almost gone. And then I collapsed on a chair as someone came running up to me. When I woke up, I was lying on a cot in a small room, with the fluorescent light buzzing softly. A nurse was hovering over me, her expression a mixture of concern and relief. "You're lucky," she murmured, her voice soothing but firm. "Mild concussion, lots of bruises, but you'll be okay." I barely managed to nod, but my throat was dry and ached everywhere. The police came a few hours later. They'd actually found my car, abandoned on the outskirts of the village, stolen by a group of drunk teenagers who thought it would be funny to pull a stunt like that. They were all caught and are awaiting trial. But that didn't change what happened. That didn't ease the terror. I should have listened to my instinct to keep driving, but I didn't. And I'll never forget what happened that night. Because sometimes evil doesn't come with a warning, it's just there waiting, right there in the dark. And of course, if you see something like that in the dark, don't stop for it. I was 13 years old when this happened. I still remember the feeling. The way the cold night air seemed to creep into my room through the thin window glass, making the hairs on my arm stand on end. It was just past 3 a.m. and I was lying in bed, wide awake as usual. Sleep never came easy for me, especially not on nights like this one where everything was too quiet. The house was silent, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards when I shifted my weight. I was alone. My mom was doing a night shift at the hospital, something she did often back then, so I was used to being alone. That's when I heard a loud knock. It was very loud. The sound echoed through the small house like a gunshot, making my eyes snap open. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. And then it came again, each knock more frantic and more desperate than the last. My heart hammered in my ears as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. Was it my mum? Was she back? Why didn't she just open the door? And that's when I heard a voice, cutting through the silence like a blade. "Help! My mum needs help, please help!" My blood turned to ice. She sounded young, maybe around my age, her words barely making any sense. She kept pounding on the door, her cries intensifying and getting desperate. "Please, I don't know what to do." I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. My mind was screaming at me to get up and go to the door to do anything. But I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed in fear. I knew better. I'd heard stories. People use tactics like this to lure you out. I'd read enough horrors online and watched enough true crime to know that sometimes it wasn't the person begging for help who was the real threat. It was whoever was in the shadows waiting. But what if it was real? My body was shaking, my hands trembling so badly that I had to press them against my legs to steady them. I stayed in bed, barely daring to breathe. I kept telling myself that if I stayed quiet, whoever was out there would go away. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing it all to be a bad dream, but the screams didn't stop. "Please, he's coming!" And then she stopped. The sudden silence was worse than her cries. The air grew heavy, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. I strained to hear, but everything was too quiet. I almost convinced myself that she had left, until I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the side of the house. My window was close to the front door, too close. I could hear everything, every crunch of gravel, every rustle of leaves underfoot. I heard something brush against the wall outside, and then a man's voice. "Shut up." His voice was low. I heard the girl whimper, and then the sound of dragging. I wanted to look, I wanted to peek out of the window just to see what was happening, but I couldn't. I was too afraid. I stayed there, my body locked in place, and I was barely able to think. My heart pounding so loud I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. Then came the sound of footsteps again, heavier this time, moving away towards the street. For a long time I stayed frozen in my bed, listening to the silence, waiting for, well, I'm not entirely sure what. But nothing happened. Hours passed and I didn't move and I didn't call anyone. I just stayed there, too scared to even breathe loudly. Eventually I ended up passing out, and in the morning my mum was already home when I woke up. I was still in the same position, my body stiff and numb. But when she asked me how my night was, I never said anything. What was I supposed to say? That I heard a girl get taken and did nothing? That I was too scared to even look out the window? I was ashamed. And if I'm honest, I don't even want to know what I would have seen. I wouldn't have been able to handle it anyway. I'm about to go off to college, to Tulane University. But before I do, I need to get this story off my chest. When I was in 6th grade, I went to a school at Columbia Grammar/Prep School in New York, which is one of the oldest schools in the country. I'd been there since kindergarten and pretty much befriended everyone in my grade throughout all the years. Only this one guy made me question why I came to this school in the first place. His name was Jack. He was new to the school that year. At first he seemed well-mannered, but you can't always underthink. He would sit next to me in all my classes and would sit at the same table I was at lunch. I wasn't too sure if he liked me, or if he just wanted to be friends with me, but I wasn't too worried about it. After some time he asked for my number, and I gave it to him, thinking he wouldn't be creepy over text. He was normal at first, asking about school-related stuff and current events that were going on in the world. The texts were normal at first, but one day he asked me out. To be real, I wasn't surprised because I was expecting him to do it at some point, but didn't even know when. I wasn't offended when he asked me, but I politely declined his invitation. After this, he ended the call right away. I hoped that I didn't hurt his feelings, but everyone takes things in different ways. I texted him saying, "I'm sorry, Jack, I just don't like you like that." He didn't respond back for the whole night. The next day we had school and I saw Jack there. I tried to talk to him, hoping to sort things out, but he would just ignore me and walk away. I must have hurt his feelings really bad, but I still wasn't going to give him what he wanted. The rest of the day went by and he would continually avoid me. I went home that night on the school bus and noticed that Jack was staring at me from outside while I was sitting down. He looked really angry, and I decided right there that I would no longer try to talk to him until he apologized and to let me know we could move on from this. The next day came. During the hours in the early morning, I got told from one of my teachers that I had to go to the headmaster's office. I was so confused, because what could I have possibly done this time? I make my way to the office, and the headmaster told me to have a seat. I listened to him and asked him if I was in trouble, and he apparently said he had been informed that I had been cyberbullying Alex and Jackson. Those were 2 kids in my grade. I was bewildered by hearing this, and I defended myself and assured him that I did not do that. He then went on to say he had proof, and he pulled out a piece of paper from his desk and showed me a picture with messages between me and Alex and Jason through text. I was astounded seeing this, and I told the headmaster that this was photoshopped. He said to me I had 24 hours to prove that it was fake, and if it's not, I would be suspended for 2 weeks. I had to think fast and take steps quickly, so I took a picture of the paper and left the office. At lunchtime, I went over to Alex and Jason, who were both sitting on the same table. I grabbed both of them and said I needed them right now. They both squinted their eyes as they obviously didn't know why, and told them that Jack had spread a rumor that I had been bullying them. They had such confused expressions on their faces as they didn't know what I was talking about. I pulled out my phone and showed them the picture, and after they saw the photo, their faces turned to horror. Jason asked why anyone would do anything like that, and what I had done to him. I simply didn't do anything, I responded back. He asked me to go out with him and I said no, and that was that. We headed to the headmaster's office. Both Alex and Jason declared I wasn't cyberbullying them, and to prove it they showed the conversations via text that we had had between us, and it was very clear that there was nothing there. Later that night, I got an email from the assistant principal saying that Jack had been suspended for a week for spreading misinformation about me cyberbullying other students. I was happy because I wouldn't have to run into him at school for a whole week, and hopefully when he came back, he'd have reflected on this and we could just leave it behind us. The weekend came and went, and I was on my way home from dance class. I was on the block, walking alone on my phone at night, when suddenly I was interrupted by a loud, "Hey!" I turned my head to see who it was, and it was none other than Jack. I was stunned to see him in the neighborhood. How did he even know where I lived? I asked Jack, "How did you find me?" He began berating me, saying how I wasn't going out with him, how he had been planning this since we first met, and that I was treating him very badly. I was just about to lose it but remained cool and didn't want to make a scene. "How could you do this to me?" he screamed, his face twisted in rage. I took a step back, my heart pounding. "Jack, how did you find me?" "I know everything about you." His voice echoed down the empty street. "You think you can humiliate me and get away with it? You think this is over?" I was frozen in place, my body screaming to run, but I couldn't move. "After everything I did for you, you didn't even give me a chance." His voice cracked with rage, and then he raised his fists. That's when instinct kicked in and I ran. I bolted down the street, my lungs burning as I pushed myself faster than I ever had before in my life. I could hear his footsteps pounding behind me and getting closer. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I was almost home when I saw my building. My doorman was outside, and as soon as I got close, I screamed for help. Jack stopped dead in his tracks, his face pale. And before the doorman could even react, Jack turned and ran. I stumbled into the lobby, gasping for air with my whole body shaking. The doorman asked me who that was, but I could barely speak, and just mumbled it was someone from my school who had taken to stalking me. He asked if he should call the cops, but I was too afraid, and I just wanted it to be over. That night I told my parents everything. My mum emailed the headmaster immediately, and on Monday morning I was called into the office again. But this time it was good news. Jack had been expelled. The relief felt was overwhelming, but then I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't safe. The rest of my middle school years went without incident. Jack was gone and I never heard from him again. But I still check over my shoulder when I'm walking home, and get knots in my stomach when I get a message from an unknown number. Because sometimes monsters don't hide under your bed. They sit next to you in class, and you never see it coming. Like most kids, my parents drilled me the same warnings over and over. Don't talk to strangers, don't accept candy, and never ever get into a car with someone you don't know. I listened. I was a cautious child, always walking on the safer side of the street, looking over my shoulder, etc. But as I got older, those childhood fears faded, and I became confident and careless. By the time I was in my early 20s, I had developed a different habit, one that would nearly cost me everything. Whenever I was angry or overwhelmed, I walked for long hours, just meandering stretches through town, lost in thought, burning off whatever frustrations had taken hold of me. These weren't casual strolls. I'd walked miles to clear my head, disappearing for nearly an entire day. Most of the time it helped, but I didn't realize how much I was letting my own guard down until one night everything changed. I had been fuming about something, work maybe, family drama. I don't even remember anymore. I just know that I needed to get away. The cool air of early autumn had started to set in as I stepped outside, the kind that makes your breath hang in the air. The sun was already dipping low, bleeding into the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that clung to the pavement like reaching fingers. I told myself I wouldn't be gone long, just a quick walk to clear my mind. But somehow, I ended up downtown. Now every town has its bad parts. In my hometown, that was downtown. The vibe shifted there after dark. The air grew heavier, the streets quieter. The buildings seemed to hunch over like they were hiding something. And as I passed by dimly lit alleys and boarded up shops, I realized how far I'd wandered. Too far. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I spotted a game store just ahead. It was one of those hide-in-the-wall places that stayed open late for tournaments and die-hard collectors. I figured I'd pop inside, kill some time, and maybe wait for the uneasy feeling in my gut to pass. That's when a group of about 6 men that were loitering near the entrance saw me. Our eyes locked, and a slow, creeping chill crawled up my spine as I realized they were watching me. "Yo, come sit with us," one of them called out, his voice slick and too familiar, like we were old friends. I put on a polite smile and shook my head, saying, "No thanks," but they didn't take no for an answer. "Come on, don't be shy. You're new around here, you look lost." Their voices echoed, too quiet in the stillness. Then the questions came, too personal and invasive. "No shoes. What size are you? What kind of phone you got? Let me see." The pit in my stomach grew heavier. I knew this wasn't going to end well. I could feel it in the way they looked at me. Almost hungry. "You want some candy?" That was it. My blood went cold. Not candy, no. This wasn't the naive, innocent offer whispering to wide-eyed kids on the playground. There was nothing innocent in the way he said it. The words dripped with something vile, the undertones sending alarm bells screaming through my head. Drugs, or worse. I kept walking, but faster now. My eyes darted to the store just beyond them. I was so close, but they were in my way, blocking the door. My pulse pounded in my ears. I couldn't risk going inside. Trapped, I'd be boxed in. No escape. I had no choice but to turn around. "Oh, come on, we're just being friendly." And the laughter followed me. It wasn't the kind of laughter you heard among friends. It was sharp and cruel, like they knew something I did not. I kept walking, my footsteps quickening with every step, my throat dry and my hands shook as I shoved them into my jacket pockets. I didn't look back. I couldn't. But I felt them, their eyes. I could almost hear their footsteps, phantom echoes in the darkness. I turned down a side street, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't know if they were following me, but I didn't care. I ran until my lungs burnt and my legs screamed for me to stop. When I finally glanced back, they were gone, or maybe they had never followed. I never went downtown again. But even now, when I go through quiet places, I can still feel their eyes on me. I can hear their voices echoing in the back of my mind. "You want some candy?" To think they were offering me drugs or something else. I'm just glad I got away. And thus ends the scary stories for tonight. I do hope you have enjoyed our true tales. If you would like to hear even more scary stories, a link can be found on screen shortly. A huge thank you as always to my members and patrons who help out financially with the running of the channel. It means a hell of a lot nowadays. Thank you everyone who is here. It means the world to me, and I hope you continue enjoying the stories for as long as you do. I'll still be here. Until next time guys, stay awesome and good night.